So, my name is
Cosmo. Welcome to my CURCA presentation. Since February of last year, I've been studying a digital community called the Phandom, with a PH, which has curated across several social platforms and online spaces. The community is centered around the consumption of various media put out by two online personalities, and has a long history of parasocial behavior towards them, involving heavy speculation and invasion of privacy, which has resulted in a notorious internet history, as well as an evolution of conduct and boundaries within the community. My project has aimed to study how the culture of this group has evolved over the last 20 years, as well as how the discourse within the given space has changed with the culture and context. This has been a process of thoroughly analyzing media put out by both the content creators and their audience, spanning from YouTube videos, stage productions, books, comments, tweets, art, memes, you name it.
Random disclaimer.
Before we get into the weeds of it, here's some important information. This project is a bit silly and whimsical, and I like to tell my friends that I got paid to watch Dan and Phil, but it's backed by ethnographic methodologies like immersion journaling, a form of digital field notes, and thorough content analysis. This presentation is a mix of everything I've studied over this time, but will primarily focus on mapping community evolution. In that same vein, I feel it's necessary to say that I'm not assigning blame or morality to any actions of any individuals within the community, past or present, and my goal is not to condemn any behavior that I've observed, it's simply to do just that. Observe and describe what I've seen in the community, telling the story of its changes over time. There are a lot of sensitive subjects within this narrative surrounding privacy and identity, but it has been and still is incredibly important that I maintain respect and dignity for all of my subjects. All data used within this study is publicly accessible on the internet, and any identifying information has been anonymized in this video. With all that out of the way, to help you understand the community, I have to introduce you to the figureheads. Dan and Phil are two YouTubers based in the United Kingdom who rose to popularity in the early to mid 2010s, though they started posting in the late 2000s. Their content originally fell under the vlogging category, a style of content that focuses on casual, conversational style and the sharing of life experiences with an audience. The style of content has died out as the culture of YouTube has evolved, but the community that sprouted around these two creators is still alive and thriving to this day, though it too has undergone a lot of changes in its lifespan. Due to the very personal nature of the content style, it can be easy for audiences to get attached to their favorite content creators and get a sense of knowing these strangers better than they really do, which is exactly what happened in this community. I don't have 20 years to explain the whole 9 yards of fandom history, so here's what you really need to know. Phil Lester started posting to YouTube in March of 2006, one of the first long-standing content creators to join the platform and curate an audience. The early community mostly found its home on YouTube, Twitter, and MySpace, God rest its soul. It was a niche low pocket full of emos and closeted queer people, one of which was Dan Howell, who formed his own parasocial relationship and went on to stalk, as he put it, and befriend his favorite YouTuber. The two started dating with no real label at some point in 2009, and upon their first eventual YouTube video together, Phil's fans sensed the chemistry immediately. Dan and Phil quickly cemented themselves as an iconic pair online, making more and more content together and curating a fanbase that was becoming deeply invested in their personal dynamic. This period of time, called the fetus era due to how young the creators and community were, was very casual and personal, a time where Dan and Phil were interacting with their social platforms as everyday users, rather than creators trying to curate any kind of audience or brand. Dan went on to drop out of college and move in with Phil, however, after finding a passion in content creation, which kickstarted their early success. Now with an awareness of their small but growing fanbase, Dan and Phil started to streamline their content towards the audience. Casual story times became themed videos, they participated in various trends across the platform, and were starting to really carve their niche into the early internet culture. The parasocial behavior of the audience was really starting to take off at this point, with fans doing what they could to dig into the personal lives of total strangers. At the time, privacy wasn't as much of a concern to the general digital public, so some innocent ways that Dan and Phil interacted with the digital space were abused, like thorough analysis of their apartment and bedrooms, which they filmed in, and fans finding where they lived using clips that showed the surrounding area. Speculation was also ramping up in regards to their sexual orientation and relationship status. Though both Dan and Phil presented themselves as straight men online, very insistently in some cases, fans were adamant that there was some kind of hidden narrative, that the two were in love with each other and hiding it from the world, and that wasn't fair. Didn't they have a right to know if their favorite ship was real? In response to this, tensions began to rise both within the community and with the creators themselves, as everyone began to ask the big question: Is fan real? After gaining a more professional platform at BBC Radio, Dan and Phil's cultural relevance started to reach new levels. 2014 was the year that Dan and Phil truly cemented themselves into the culture of the internet. In the mid-2010s, they committed to content creation in a self-described say yes to everything era. In those next few years, they opened a merch shop, started a joint gaming channel, went on 2 world tours, published 2 books together, started a long-running Sims 4 series, collaborated with the biggest names on YouTube, won several awards, and curated a notoriously chaotic fanbase that peaked into the multi-millions. Dan and Phil have always been pretty fond of their audience, but the constant speculation and invasion of boundaries still took a toll on their mental health. To a point of moving into 2 apartments, one for them to live in and one to film in, they slowly started to separate their personal lives from their professional ones. Dan especially was suffering with some serious mental health issues that he needed space to confront, some of which he began to speak about on a public platform, but the real measure of self-care came in 2018. After returning from their second world tour, the 2 of them started wrapping some things up. It was a slow burn of ending beloved and long-running series such as Dan vs. Phil, Phil is Not on Fire, and even their Sims series. At the end of the latter, they announced that they would be going on an indefinite hiatus, taking a break from the constant grind of content creation. Their fanbase understood the kind of burnout that would come after such a long world tour and all the effort they'd put into the last year, so of course Dan and Phil deserved a break. Surely they'd be back to posting within a couple months, though. Phil was the first one to come back from their little break, posting his first video at the end of January, in which he changed his video background from his bedroom in the fake apartment to a cute little corner setup with all the personality-filled decor that made Phil's bedroom background so unique. It had been a long-running joke that the setup of cameras being pointed at their beds was weird and almost pornographic in nature, but this seemed to be Phil finally acting on that and creating more separation between his personal and professional lives. As for Dan, it was radio silence for months after the hiatus, until midway through June 2019, he posted a 45-minute video called, "Basically, I'm Gay." The video was, as the title suggests, a coming out video, but it was more than that in typical Dan Howell fashion. It was a retrospective on Dan's entire own queer history and the accompanying trauma, what the words gay and queer mean to him and why, and it came with soft confirmation of the deep connection that fans had perceived between himself and Phil.
And this is when, through the magic of the internet, I met Phil. And obviously, we were more than friends, but it was more than just romantic. This is someone that genuinely liked me. We are real best friends, companions through life, like actual soulmates.
This video had a huge impact on the community in many ways. It served to confirm the speculation on Dan's sexuality, it gave a new context to the perception of Dan and Phil's relationship, and most importantly, it inspired a lot of their young queer audience to see a queer adult share his authentic self and his story. Phil followed this video at the end of June with his own coming out video, a much shorter account of his coming out journey and advice to people in the same position. With both of them now publicly labeling themselves as gay, having lived together for almost a decade, and eventually buying a house together, the evidence of Dan and Phil being a real couple was strong as ever, especially after Dan proclaiming them as soulmates. The tone had dramatically shifted after their coming out videos, however, as fans were left with an opportunity to reflect on how their aggressive invasions and speculations may have affected the real people behind the videos they obsessed over. They had plenty of time to reflect on the concept, as Dan's absence from the internet extended all the way into May of 2022, until he posted a video going over where he'd been and his own plans to continue making content. Most of his plans before this point had been disrupted by the global pandemic, though he'd managed to publish a best-selling mental health guide in that time, but it seemed like his approach for the time being was geared towards solo content rather than the joint Dan and Phil brand that their audience was used to. In this time, he started a comedy series on YouTube and went on a world tour, his goal being to find enjoyment in his career once again. A lot of people weren't big fans of this new style, the edginess of Dan's solo content not hitting the same beats that some of the general audience enjoyed when the pair could bounce off of one another. Still, Dan managed to find fulfillment and joy from his solo ventures, so much that when Phil proposed starting to make videos on the joint channel again, they got together and threw a funeral.
Jesus Christ! Enchelte Zombo.
What the
With the return of the gaming channel in mid-2023, Dan and Phil were finally posting new joint content for an audience that had matured considerably in the years since. There was a new context to this older Dan and Phil, a newer and more authentic presentation of themselves that fans described as like when you grow up and your family starts spilling old tea. Now knowing that the 2 were gay and having a better understanding of those connotations, fans viewed Dan and Phil's relationship in a different light. There was still a level of speculation, but it had grown far less invasive and operated under a loose understanding of being unspoken and frankly, no one's business but theirs. In that same vein, Dan and Phil now conducted themselves differently, starting to have fun with the scrutiny they'd been under for so long and playing into long-running jokes and observations, such as them sharing clothes. This was very much a trial period for them, a test to see what the remaining fanbase was like after so many years, and whether or not YouTube was still a space that they could enjoy making content in. It was a successful venture, and the Dan and Phil renaissance culminated in the return of some beloved traditions and a third world tour that focused on the influence they'd had on their audience through the years. This show got very deeply personal and started to recontextualize old parts of the community's history, but mostly served as a reclamation of the culture that they had created. They've said that the audience they have today feels the most like their own, that this audience truly loves their personalities and enjoys what they're putting out there. Dan and Phil had finally reached a point of owning and loving what they do, and after so much time in the YouTube space, had finally found a comfortable balance between privacy and sharing their lives with their audience. At this point, I had witnessed a beautiful transformation of the community, and I felt confident in my ability to observe and analyze the narrative. After all, what better perspective could you get than Dan and Phil reclaiming their own history? On October 13th, 2025, 8 months into this project, I got a notification on Twitter that had made waves on the internet. Dan and Phil had been teasing a rebrand for months, and the time had finally come to put a shiny new makeover onto their channel. Speculations were rampant. People wanted podcasts, new merch, content styles, whatever had been brewing. What we as a community were not expecting was a 45-minute long video called Is Fan Real? The Truth. At this point, the audience had come to peace with never knowing the true status or story of Dan and Phil's relationship, so this video hit the entire community like the Pompeii eruption. This video went over their relationship, various events throughout that time like the infamous Valentine's Day video, and mainly the impact that the parasocial speculation has taken on them and their relationship. People have joked that among the modern trend of apology videos, Dan and Phil are the first YouTubers to have made a forgiveness video, so it's worth mentioning that they treat this history with a lot of grace and love for their community rather than resentment or blame. The main point stands though that the context of their relationship had changed once again, and fans were left with entirely new perspectives and contexts to look at the community and media histories with. They can now look at every piece of old content and say, they were boyfriends here. Look at old versions of Dan and Phil at 18 and 22 and see that they were quite young to be navigating their relationship being such a big point of speculation. There were boundaries set by the creators within that coming out video, and as the two now put out content as a confirmed couple, a lot of the tension and speculation has been officially resolved and the general conduct of the community has changed. And that is a crash course in fandom history. Oh, and one last thing. The word parasocial has come up quite a bit at this point, and I kind of have to define what that means if I'm going to be analyzing a community's parasocial behavior. Luckily for me, the Cambridge Dictionary made parasocial their 2025 word of the year, defining it as involving or relating to a connection that someone feels between themselves and a famous person they do not know. This kind of behavior is and has long been the root of our celebrity culture. We uplift people for skills and talents that they possess, they become servants to our entertainment, then we in turn become obsessed with their personal lives. The invasive behavior of fans and media alike, rooted in this parasocial nature, can have devastating effects. Notably, 22-year-old singer Christina Grimmie's murder in 2016 comes to mind. She was shot in front of her family and fans at a meet and greet by 27-year-old Kevin James Loibl, whose friend later testified to Loibl's obsession with the singer. He made note that the killer would constantly monitor Grimmie on social media despite not having accounts of his own, found faith in religion due to Grimmie's own faith, and underwent physical changes like LASIK in an attempt to make himself more attractive to her, all for a person he'd never met. As demonstrated by this case, parasocial behavior has been taken to an entirely new level in the digital age. Before, celebrities had an untouchable nature to them, as the public could only access them through traditional media. Films, books, tabloids, exclusive spaces that provided distance in time and space. In the dawning age of social media, celebrity culture changed to be much more interactive, allowing a new level of access and engagement on both ends of these parasocial relationships. With the ability to post in real time and the new cultural norm of sharing our everyday lives, our expectations of privacy have shifted dramatically and repeatedly. Mix this phenomenon with the inherent ease of access that online personalities rely on to curate their communities, and the parasocial problem suddenly becomes much worse. The fandom is an extra special case that reached such deep levels of this behavior due to a variety of conditions, including but not limited to the personal and conversational nature of the content, the intimacy of video settings within Dan and Phil's home, an overarching narrative of their relationship dynamic, both platonic and romantic, Dan and Phil's habit of oversharing, a very young audience of primarily children and social outcasts, a desire in the community for representation, and a voyeuristic satisfaction gained from being in on the secret. In short, Dan and Phil unintentionally created the perfect storm for parasocial relationships simply by choosing to share their lives with the internet. It isn't necessarily a bad thing, and I don't want to assign morality to the behavior I've observed over the history of the community, but I think they've learned some very valuable lessons over the years, like don't publish your entire apartment's floor plan in a book, or your fans will know exactly how to recreate it on Roblox nearly a decade later. Yes, that's a real thing that happened, which brings us into my last section. The fandom has been an active community for 20 years and has produced a lot of media to look at over that time. I mean, the chronological Dan and Phil video playlist is over 3,000 videos, and the two of them have collectively gone on 4 tours, published 3 books, produced several waves of merch, produced a board game and a mobile game, started a podcast, participated in many trends, collaborated with other creators, written fanfiction about themselves, and that doesn't even get into any content produced by the community itself. To save myself some time and sanity, I mainly focused on content published by Dan and Phil themselves, in an effort to analyze the content being consumed by the audience as well as how it was being perceived, mostly consisting of their tours, books, and YouTube videos. My goal was to map how the community changed before, during, and after the hiatus period in response to the changing contexts of broader popular culture and Dan and Phil's identities. To do that, I primarily focused on YouTube comments and Twitter posts, observing how the community interacts and constructs its discourse. It would be impossible to encompass the whole community in such a short span of time, and I've already given you a pretty good look at the history, but here's a few last things I thought were pretty cool. A Twitter user did a census sampling a portion of the community, providing me with insight on the average member of the fandom. The census concluded the following stats for the end of 2025. Most fannies are between the ages of 16 and 30, with the largest concentration being 22 to 25 years old. Over half of participants identify as female, with the second largest category identifying as non-binary. Nearly 70% answered that they speak English, with the following top 5 languages as Spanish, French, Portuguese, Russian, and Italian. The top 5 countries represented in the data are the USA, England, Canada, Australia, and the UK. About 1 in 4 participants answered that they are disabled. Further, 60% identified themselves as neurodivergent, with a further 26% stating that they are unsure. An overwhelming 89% of participants identify as LGBTQ+. 25% of participants identify as transgender, with a further 9% that are unsure, and the top 5 sexuality demographics are bisexual, lesbian, queer, asexual, and straight. The majority of participant answers indicated that they joined the fandom in the peak Dan and Phil era, with the official height of nearly 3,000 people in 2015. A whopping 23 participants have been watching Phil's videos since he started all the way back in 2006, and over 1,500 answered that they joined in 2025, a record high since 2016. Participants were asked to describe Dan and Phil in one word, both as individuals and a pair. The top 5 results for Dan were loud, inspiring, relatable, funny, and sarcastic. The top 5 results for Phil were whimsical, silly, amazing, princess, and sunshine. To describe them as a pair, the top 5 results were gay, soulmates, love, dads, and comfort. The overwhelming majority of participants are positive about the community itself, very few seeing the community negatively. Lightning round, 69% of participants have bought merchandise from Dan and Phil, with the majority of the community feeling neutral about the merch provider. 73% are members of the Patreon community, with a further 1 in 3 participants paying for exclusive content. Most participants have never been noticed by Dan and Phil, only 17% claiming to have had a social media interaction with one or both. In that same vein, 14% of participants have had an in-person interaction with Dan and or Phil, likely at their stage shows. Most participants have not attended any of those shows, and their most recent tour had the biggest audience, with nearly 6,500 participants saying they went to see Terrible Influence. The average participant of this survey is participatory in the community, with nearly 2/3 claiming they're at least somewhat active in the fandom. While not necessarily representative of the entire community, this census gives us a peek into the average demographics of the wider community. The vast majority of those who answered the survey fall into at least one of many groups that may feel unsafe or unwelcome in traditional social spaces. It's through this community and others like it that they find others like themselves, creating a social space around shared interests and forming a global community that's safe for said social misfits. There's so much more I could say on this subject, so much more of the fandom to be studied, and if I had time I would go so much deeper into specifics, but at the end of the day has to end. So let's wrap things up. When Phil posted that first video to YouTube 20 years ago, he was neither trying nor expecting to curate the massive audience that has since formed around him and his long-term partner. Still, people from all across the world have come together to create an online space to find comfort in the creative works of two people they've likely never met, the narrative surrounding the relationship between those creatives, and the community of others just like them. The fandom has undergone many cultural and behavioral changes in the last 20 years, the boundaries between creators and audience existing as fluid structures shaped by the context and humor of the community. What was once a taboo subject that sparked heated debate in online spaces is now confirmed to the masses and joked about endlessly by insiders and outsiders of the community alike. Through its infamous and bizarre existence on the internet, the fandom has done a lot more than make RPF shipping legal. It's given people a place to gather and bond over shared interests and experiences, to make friends they never might have met due to geographic distance, to share in a group space that accepts gay alternative weirdos who might otherwise feel ostracized in everyday life. The fandom isn't just a fandom, it's a community with culture, history, and one hell of a digital footprint. All my love to and from the fandom, and thank you for watching.